So guys, first and foremost, going to discuss George Groves versus David Brophy. Two obvious ways of beating George Groves. Number one, chin him. You know, he's shown in the past that he maybe doesn't have elite level punch resistance. We saw Carl Frott's able to stop him twice. The second time with a huge one-punch knockout. Carl Frott's, he carried a bit of power, but perhaps not known as a one-punch knockout artist otherwise. We saw him dropped by Badu Jack. We saw him dropped earlier on in his career by Kenny Anderson. And there's some suspicion that the Saint doesn't have the world's best jaw in the chin department. So number one is to chin him. Number two is to drag him deep and see if his stamina holds up. Time and time again, there's been concerns of George Groves' stamina late on in fights. So, you know, if you're the kind of fighter who can pull him into the trenches, rough him up on the inside, force the pace on him and make him work for every minute of every round, you might have joy. Now, looking at David Brophy, I'm afraid I don't see either of those things. David Brophy looks to be a decent fighter. He's obviously undefeated, but he's very, very ABC. And there's nothing wrong with that, but he's kind of ABC in a sense where you could see him getting to like English, British level, but you don't potentially have him seeing the upside of getting to European level or world level. And George Groves, even if you say that he's sort of world level, and you could make a very strong argument that that is the case, he's most certainly upper European level. You know, he's got some good wins on his resume. Let's not forget he's got wins over the likes of James DeGale, Paul Smith, Christopher Brass, etc. So, it's an interesting fight. It's always good to see a domestic level clash. Brophy I see as a guy who fights behind a jab, looks to come out and establish the jab early, sometimes can throw nicely to the body. If he's got the jab established, he can work off that and try and, make an opponent put their hands high with the jab and then throw a hook to the body. Not a big puncher, I'm afraid. You know, his knockout percentage is very, very low, even given the fact that he's been in against quite a low level of opposition. And you'd have to assume that whilst George Groves may be susceptible to getting hurt against elite power punchers, you'd have to assume that David Brophy is not going to be in that league in the punching stakes. My concern with Brophy is twofold, really. Well, threefold. Firstly, I just don't think he's got the style that's necessarily going to cause havoc to George Groves. George Groves, one of his best attributes is his jab. And I think if Brophy wants to come out, establish the jab and work off the jab, which is what he seems to do on the footage I've watched of him, I think he's going to lose that battle 7 days a week and twice on a Sunday against George Groves. He's simply not going to outbox George Groves behind the jab. And I'm not sure Brophy, with his kind of ABC style, is going to be able to adjust and bring a plan B to affect a fighter like George Groves, if I'm right in thinking that his jabbing game may prove ineffective. You know, the size difference between these two was obvious, and I think that that will be a factor, especially if the fight becomes a battle of the jabs, like I suspect it will be, because I suspect that George Groves not only has the better jab in terms of power, speed, accuracy, but I also suspect he's the longer man, the bigger reach. You know, he was 2 or 3 inches taller than Brophy, and to be honest, he looked a lot stronger as well in terms of his build. He looks like a lot bigger man than Brophy, possibly even a weight class above. And I'm actually very, very interested to see what the guys weigh in at, because although Matchroom and Eddie Hearn didn't overly publicise it, George Groves' last fight against Andrea De Luisa was at a catchweight, in the low 170s, and I thought Groves looked a lot better on the scales. He looked a lot less drained. And for a fighter whose main problems are stamina and punch resistance, the fact that he can maybe come in 2 or 3 pounds heavier than super middleweight limit is a major, major plus. So it'd be interesting to see if this is at the 168 limit or if this is at 170, 171. And if it is, you'd have to say that is a huge advantage to George Groves over David Brophy. Primarily because he's the bigger man to begin with, but also secondly because the risk of George Groves losing with his stamina running out or his punch resistance being decreased, for me they are negated if he doesn't have to make the 168-pound limit. So I think that's an important factor to watch out for. In terms of how I see the fight going, the early rounds I see being fairly tentative. As I say, both men will come out, look to move, look to establish their jabs. David Brophy probably won't be looking to do anything silly in this stage. You know, he might be a bit tentative, cautious, looking to take George Groves to the second half of the fight, perhaps. You know, he's going to be keeping his hands very high. He's got a tight guard. Sometimes he's a bit vulnerable to the body, but on the whole, he keeps a tight guard. And I think the guys are going to be fighting behind the jab. You know, after 3 or 4 rounds, I suspect George Groves will be up on the scorecards. I suspect he'll be out jabbing David Brophy, and David Brophy will have to gamble, have to try and do something different. But looking at the footage I've seen of him, I think he's a pretty stereotypical boxer type, and I think he'll struggle to make the adjustment. And I think, you know, whilst I've not got any knowledge about his chin or, you know, any real knowledge about how he's going to react when the pressure's put on him, I suspect, given the level he's been operating at, that George Groves will prove too much too soon. You know, the lack of an intermediate fight, the lack of a win over a Rocky Fielding or a Paul Smith or a Frank Buglioni, you know, just somebody to bridge the gap between the level he's been fighting at and George Groves will sow. And I suspect George Groves will win the fight by a middle round stoppage. You know, so that he's a class above at this level. That's my thoughts personally. I just don't think Brophy has got the size or the style to beat George Groves. I think if you're a small man and a lighter puncher and you fight behind the jabs, you're going to have to be very, very, very good indeed to outbox George Groves. And looking at Brophy, I'm just not sure. You know, Carl Frotz came and put it on him, made him work, pushed him back, roughed him up. Was able to have the punching power to hurt him. I'm not seeing that in Brophy's game. I'm going George Groves by middle round stoppage. Now, Eric Hunter versus Selby is a fight that a lot of people are viewing as a competitive matchup, and I can see why. You know, if you look at BoxRec, it's not too exciting, Eric Hunter. You know, he's a lot lower ranked than Selby. He maybe hasn't beaten the marquee names. You know, I know Selby's beaten Gradovitz and Joel Brunker, names that we maybe know a bit more. You know, we can see that Eric Hunter's had 2 losses through DQ, which never bodes well. One of his wins was by split decision, which suggests he's hardly a dominant force, you know. So it doesn't bode well. Also, the fact that he's 5'6", and I think Selby's 5'8.5", 5'9", you know, kind of suggests that Lee Selby may be the bigger man. I know Selby's quite big at the weight. He can box long. He's got that sort of range and reach that he looks to establish with his outside boxing. And, you know, these are all good signs for Lee Selby ahead of the fight. Now, I've taken a look at Eric Hunter. You know, I've watched him, a few clips of him. I'm not going to suggest I've seen an exhaustive amount. He is actually, he looks okay. He looks quite good, actually. Yeah, in terms of watching the footage of him, I'm not spotting any glaring weaknesses. I'm not spotting any areas that I'm thinking, oh, Lee Selby's going to have a whale of a time with that. You know, I'd say that Hunter is a guy who boxes. He tries to throw a jab. He's orthodox, but he's not afraid to mix it up. You know, once he's boxed, he's happy to come in. He's happy to throw a variety of punches. He goes to the body fairly nicely. You know, and he can be quite offensively minded in the pocket. You know, he looks a solid fighter. He looks like a decent guy who could get to a high level in the sport. The problem is, and this is, it's almost a casual fan thing to say, but I've got to be honest, I haven't invested the time in Eric Hunter that I needed to ahead of this fight. So I'm basing my prediction here off, you know, 20 minutes research and a few clips rather than the amount of research I should, which always leaves me open for getting things badly wrong. But the problem is, if you look at Eric Hunter, you're not blown away by him. You're not thinking this is a guy who's going to be a dominant world champion. You're not thinking this is a guy who's going to be troubling the pound for pound rankings anytime soon. And, you know, Lee Selby at his best is superb. You know, Lee Selby at his best is superb. And he's actually one of the top boxers in this country. Technically, he's so sound. He's got an excellent jab. His punch variety is superb. His combinations are superb. His movement's superb. He's slick defensively. He's supposed to have an excellent chin. You know, Lee Selby looks to me like a world class operator. And based on the limited footage I've seen of Eric Hunter, whilst Hunter's capable, whilst he's solid, I don't think he's got the same upside as a Lee Selby. I don't think he's got the same class as a Lee Selby. And the fact that he's been pushed very close in fights before against, opposition that isn't as well known. The fact that he's dropped losses, been brought in as a short notice opponent and dropped losses and had DQs and had that sort of trouble, just for me is building a picture here of a guy who maybe isn't in the same class as Lee Selby. So, it's not the most well-informed prediction I've ever made. Hunter apparently is very, very solid. He's got a good chin. I don't believe he's ever been stopped before. Obviously the DQs, I guess, count as being stopped. But, Selby isn't the most consistent puncher, but he's a guy who can frustrate you and beat you up over several rounds. So whether it's a late stoppage or knockout, I don't know. The bookmakers are saying it will go to points. So I guess the sensible suggestion is Lee Selby on points. And it could be an interesting fight, this, but I just see Selby's upside as very slightly higher. So that's my thoughts there. I haven't had the time to look at Jamie McDonald's opponent. I haven't had the time to look at Ohara Davis's opponent. If I do get time, I'll try and do videos ahead of the fights. But for now, I wanted to cover off Selby and Groves. They're two of the big fights that people are talking about in detail. So I wanted to do a video on those. Let me know your thoughts, guys. How are you picking either fight? Do you see the potential for an upset on either fight? I'm keen to discuss. If you've enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up. If you're new to the channel or you haven't subscribed before, please do hit subscribe. I wouldn't want you to miss out on my post-fight coverage of all the action this weekend. Great week of boxing ahead. Many thanks for watching. Enjoy the fights, guys.